17. A host of diseases. I now want to talk of a number of quite unrelated conditions in which there is evidence of very varying strength that sugar might perhaps be involved. Damage to the eyes. Ophthalmologists had for a very long time wondered whether nutrition could affect the way the eye developed, and thereby affect such conditions as long-sightedness or short-sightedness. There was some suggestion that short-sightedness, myopia, occurred in children when their diets were short of protein. The research on which this notion was based was not considered acceptable by the experts, and there is nowadays no support for this view. One of my colleagues, together with an ophthalmologist, looked at the problem by doing some experiments with rats. They too could find no effects of diets that were simply deficient in protein. They then studied the effects of diets that were low in protein but also high in sugar, the types of diets known to be common among the rapidly increasing populations of the large cities in the poorer parts of the world. In one experiment, they fed rats on diets low in protein and with or without sugar. After 6 or 7 months, both of these groups had grown poorly compared with control rats fed the normal high-protein diet. The investigators found no significant difference in refraction between the normal rats and those on the low-protein, high-starch diet. But the rats fed the low-protein, high-sugar diet had a considerable degree of myopia, amounting to 1 diopter. In a second experiment, they took another 3 groups of rats. One group was placed on a normal diet, the second on the low-protein diet with sugar, the third group on the normal diet but with the amount restricted so that the rats grew at the same low rate as did the rats on the sugar diet. After 9 weeks there was no difference in refraction between the groups, but by week 15 the sugar-fed rats had developed myopia, again to the extent of nearly 1 diopter, compared with the normal group and with the poorly fed group. At this point, the diets of the second and third groups were reversed. One result was that the poorly fed group, with normal refraction up to the time of the change, became myopic within 3 weeks of having started the diet with sugar. The other result was that the sugar-fed group, with myopia at the time of the changeover, did not improve during the whole of the rest of the experiment, even though it lasted for 23 weeks after the change. We also measured eye refraction in student volunteers who were the subjects of one of our experiments. As before, we took a large number of measurements before and after they were given a high-sugar diet. After 2 weeks on this diet, there was a small but quite significant change in their refraction, but this time it was a change toward long-sightedness, not toward myopia or short-sightedness. At present, we are suggesting that the reasons have to do with the level of glucose in the blood. Doctors have known for some time that diabetics develop a mild but noticeable degree of short-sightedness if their blood sugar is not properly controlled and consequently rises to an unduly high level. We believe that this may be the cause of the myopia occurring after a long period in our rats on the high-sugar diet. We know that such animals become mildly diabetic with a high blood sugar and that a low-protein diet probably accentuates the condition. In our students, the 2 weeks on a high-sugar diet tended to produce a low blood sugar, as I have shown, so one would have expected not myopia but long-sightedness. I have already mentioned that severe changes occur in the retina of the eye in diabetes, and I pointed out that similar changes can be produced in rats by feeding them with sugar. Damage to the teeth. Each year, millions of teeth are extracted by dentists from children all over the Western world. In the UK alone, the loss is 4 million teeth weighing more than 4 tons. In one survey in Dundee in Scotland, 13-year-old boys and girls were found to have an average of 10 decayed teeth. More than one-third of British adults over 16 have had every one of their teeth extracted. Fossil evidence suggests that the condition now known as dental caries or dental decay hardly occurred in prehistoric times before the introduction of agriculture and the great increase of starchy foods like cereals in man's diet. The disease became much commoner only recently. There is no doubt that this is associated with the introduction of sugar as an increasing component of the conventional diet. To understand the process of dental decay, we should know a little about the structure of the tooth. It is mainly made up of dentine, a sort of tough bone. This is covered by a thin layer consisting of enamel, the hardest tissue in the body. Inside the dentine is the soft pulp from which the dentine is made, and in it are blood vessels. As anyone who has had a toothache or visited the dentist knows, the pulp also contains highly sensitive nerve endings. Dental decay begins from plaques of material that stick on the surface of the teeth, and are found especially in the normal fissures and crevices of the tooth surface. The plaque is made up of a background material of protein and carbohydrate, which retains particles of food, debris from the saliva, and countless bacteria. Present evidence is that dental decay proceeds by the production of acid by bacteria in the plaque, especially bacteria belonging to the type called Streptococcus mutans. The acid is produced in the plaque as it adheres to the surface of the tooth. It is not washed away by the saliva, but gradually attacks the dentine until, unchecked, it exposes the sensitive pulp. The production of acid is facilitated by the buildup of a complex carbohydrate in the plaque. It seems that what the acid-producing bacteria like best in the plaque is the particular complex carbohydrate called dextrin. This can be built up from any sugar chiefly by the streptococci, but very much more is produced from sucrose. Some people are less susceptible to caries than others, partly because they appear to have inherited a higher resistance than normal, partly because they live where the drinking water contains adequate amounts of protective fluoride, partly because they clean their teeth frequently, but chiefly because they do not consume food and drinks that allow their teeth to come into prolonged contact with sugar. The epidemiological evidence about the development of dental decay includes that which I summarized earlier in regard to primitive human beings. I showed that carbohydrates in general are a relatively recent addition to the human diet. Perhaps the earliest specific mention of the association between sugar and caries was that of a German traveller, who in 1598 remarked on the black teeth of Queen Elizabeth of England, a defect the English seem subject to from their too great use of sugar. Much earlier, Aristotle spoke of teeth being damaged by figs, but he was of course not aware that their sweetness was largely due to the same sucrose that was later extracted from the cane and manufactured into the sweetmeats that ruined Queen Elizabeth's teeth. Dental caries has become the scourge of the wealthier countries, mostly during the present century. Here are some examples. In the UK, 26 million teeth were filled in 1965. In 1983, the figure was 40 million. In America, as recently as 1980, it was found that 17-year-old teenagers had an average of 6 carious teeth. In Norway in 1981, there were 16 carious tooth surfaces in the average 16-year-old. In New Zealand, school children had an average of 1.5 teeth filled during 1980. And it is said that in Germany, only 0.1% of children over 15 have caries-free teeth. That is only 1 in 1,000. See the table Percentage of Children in England and Wales with Tooth Decay. There has been a fall in the amount of tooth decay in British children in recent years, as you can see in that table. This is likely to have been due to the increase in the number of areas where water is fluoridized, the increase in the availability of fluoride toothpaste, and perhaps a slight response to increasing publicity about how to preserve the teeth. Nevertheless, there is no room for complacency when the average 15-year-old in the UK in 1983 has more than 5 decayed, missing, or filled teeth. In particular, the decrease in tooth decay has occurred only in the industrialized countries. In the developing countries, the rapid rise in caries was described by the WHO as absolutely frightening. See also the table Number of decayed, missing or filled teeth of children in England and Wales. The increase of tooth decay in populations such as the Eskimos and the inhabitants of Tristan da Cunha followed their introduction to sugar. The increase in the developing countries parallels in general the rise in the availability of sugar to these populations. In the other direction, children in Western Europe experienced a reduction in dental caries during and soon after the two world wars, when sugar was scarce. But its prevalence increased rapidly when sugar became freely available again. If we are to get rid of dental caries altogether, it is unlikely to occur simply from a continuation of the sizable reduction that, it appears, has come largely from fluoride. It will be necessary also to persuade people, and children in particular, that they should avoid eating sugary foods, especially sweets and chocolate, that tend to stick to the teeth. And ideally, this would be part of a program of nutrition education. But the problem of general nutrition education is not as easy to solve as it seems. Long ago, my colleagues and I became increasingly aware that it is necessary not only to teach people facts about nutrition, but also to get them to use these facts. More simply, the purpose of nutrition education of the public is not just to improve nutritional knowledge, but to improve nutritional behavior. A small piece of research that we carried out illustrates this very well. We asked 100 or so London mothers some questions about healthy eating, one of which was, what is the chief reason why children get holes in their teeth? More than 90% of the mothers answered that it was because the children ate sweets. But knowing this did not prevent them from buying sweets for their children. When, therefore, I was asked to give the annual foundation lecture at Newcastle Dental School, I chose as my title, Dental Caries is Preventable. Why not prevented? And discussed the whole problem of nutrition education for the public. I especially made the point that almost everyone knew that a major cause of tooth decay was the eating of sticky, sugary confectionery, cakes and biscuits. Yet that did not stop children buying these items or being given them by their elders. The lecture was published in the British Dental Journal and evoked a very angry letter from Professor B. Cohen, who was doing dental research at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. He thought it ridiculous that I had not pointed out that the holes in the teeth were caused by bacteria that produced acid. He wrote, "Until it is accepted that caries is a disease caused not by sugar, but by the action of bacteria on sugar, effort will continue to be expanded in preaching deprivation that few patients will ever practice, instead of striving to devise means for the management of an infection." Professor Cohen was at that time carrying out research designed to see if it was possible to produce a vaccine against the infection of the mouth with the caries-causing Streptococcus mutans. The experiments were with monkeys, which were encouraged to develop tooth decay. The efficacy of the experimental vaccines was tested by injecting them into half of the monkeys. I visited the laboratory soon after my lecture, and I don't suppose I need to tell you how dental decay was induced in the monkeys. You'll have guessed, I am sure, that it was by giving them lots of sticky sweets. My talk in Newcastle took place in 1969, some 18 months after the birth of my grandson and a few months before the birth of my granddaughter. They haven't had anti-Streptococcus mutans vaccine. They have, though, been careful about eating sweets and chocolates. At the ages of 18 and 16, he has one filling and she has none. As I mentioned in Chapter 3, my grandson refused to eat his birthday cake when he was 3 because it was too sweet. These observations do not prove that sugar is a cause of dental decay. I have already pointed out that the association of disease and diet in different populations can only be taken as a clue to the cause. Next, one must see whether the individuals in any one population who get caries are those who eat a lot of sugar. Curiously enough, not much research of this sort has yet been done. The dentist in Dundee to whom I referred earlier examined 13-year-old boys and girls in 1960, 1961 and 1962. They found more dental caries in those that ate more sweets, but surprisingly, they found no difference in caries among those that did or did not brush their teeth regularly. Our own research, carried out in 1967 on a much smaller number of children, also showed that there was more decay in children taking more sugar in solid foods, that is, more sweets, biscuits, and so on. But we also found that the strong relationship between sugar and decay occurred only in children who did not clean their teeth regularly. If they did clean their teeth regularly, they had little caries even when they ate a lot of sugary foods. Many experiments have been done, especially in animals, to see what changes in diet affect the teeth. As always, the precise results differ according to what animals were used, exactly what the experimental diets were, how the diets were given, and for how long. The general results, however, seem clear. When there is no carbohydrate, little or no caries is produced. Diets containing starch or bread, brown or white, produce either the same amount of caries or a very little more. Diets with any sort of sugar produce much more caries, and the most cariogenic sugar is sucrose. The best-known experiments with children are those done by the British Medical Research Council in 1950 and in the town of Vipeholm in Sweden a few years later. The first study lasted for 2 years and showed that the addition of sugar during mealtimes did not increase the amount of caries in children. The second study compared sugar given in different ways for 4 years and found that little additional caries occurred if the sugar was taken at meals, but much more occurred when it was taken as sweets between meals, and especially if it was taken as sticky toffees between meals. Obviously, what matters is whether the sugar is in contact with the teeth for some time. Sticky sweets and cakes and biscuits between meals are the chief culprits, especially if their residue is allowed to remain without being exposed to a good and prolonged toothbrushing. A great deal of attention has been directed toward what is called rampant caries. The custom seems to have grown of giving babies dummies to suck that might have a small container in which syrup is put. The effect of this, or of giving ordinary dummies constantly dipped into sugar, is that the baby's teeth become rotten as they erupt, so that at the age of 2 or 3 years their mouths are full of blackened stumps. In one survey, 1 baby in 12 was found to be suffering from rampant caries. In another, the figure was 1 in 8. One of the most interesting and unexpected of the observations of the role of sugar in producing dental caries comes from a study of a rare disease, hereditary fructose intolerance. Only a few families have been discovered with members suffering from this disease, and they become violently sick whenever they get fructose or sucrose, which you will recall is a compound made up of equal amounts of glucose and fructose. Very early in life, therefore, they learn to avoid fruits and anything containing sucrose. They can and do eat starchy foods, since starch is digested to give only glucose. But even though they eat lots of white bread made from what people like to call refined flour, they have very little caries, and what they do have is of a very minor degree. One day perhaps we shall be able to immunize children against the bacteria that are involved in producing caries. But although experiments aimed at producing immunity to caries have been in progress for nearly 20 years, a practical vaccine has still not been produced. Damage to the skin. In measuring the amount of sugar consumed by hospital patients, I was chiefly interested in those with coronary disease. But it occurred to me that it would be interesting to see how much sugar was taken by patients with 2 or 3 other conditions. There are, for example, conditions such as acne, blackheads, which occur quite frequently in teenagers, and which doctors believe is caused or made worse by the eating of confectionery. We measured sugar intake in these patients and compared it with that of people of the same age and sex without acne. We also decided to look at another common skin disease called seborrheic dermatitis, but not this time because diet had been implicated by physicians. The reason was that this condition has to do with the secretion of the glands in the skin of the oily substance called sebum. There is some evidence that this material is altered when the diet is rich in sugar. So we also measured the sugar intake of patients with this disease and compared it with that of people without seborrheic dermatitis, each one chosen so as to be the same sex and age as a patient with the disease. It turned out that the acne patients were not taking any more sugar than the control subjects, but that those with seborrheic dermatitis were taking appreciably more. The implications of these results is that sugar is not involved in producing acne, but may be involved in producing seborrheic dermatitis. We could extend these conclusions by saying that it is unlikely that acne patients would get better if they ate less sugar, although it may be that they are especially sensitive. They might therefore be suffering from acne partly because of sugar, even though they do not take more than other people, and if this were so, they would indeed be better off taking less sugar. But no one has really done a properly controlled test to see whether less sugar does make them better. As for seborrheic dermatitis, the fact that sufferers are heavy sugar eaters at once suggests that we should see if we can improve them with a low-sugar diet. Although the results look promising, we have not been able to continue our research. We shall have to wait for others to take it up. Damage to the joints. Gout has always interested doctors. The popular idea of gout is that it is found in people who overindulge in rich food and in alcohol. In England, we think of the retired colonel drinking his bottle of port a day. It is often thought to be very rare nowadays, but in fact it is not all that rare. It occurs mostly in middle age and later, and more in men than in women. The reasons that made it seem worth looking at sugar consumption by gouty patients were pretty flimsy, I must admit. First, one of the features often found in people with atherosclerosis and found in all people with gout is a raised level of uric acid in the blood. Second, In human beings and in some animals, a diet high in sugar increases the concentration of uric acid in the blood. Third, people with gout are more likely than other people to get coronary thrombosis, and conversely, people with coronary disease are more likely to have gout. So we studied patients in 2 or 3 rheumatic clinics. We had in fact 3 groups of people: patients with gout, patients with a different rheumatic disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and normal individuals who were apparently quite healthy. As usual, the 3 groups of subjects were matched for age and sex. As we half expected, the patients with rheumatoid arthritis were eating the same amounts of sugar as the control subjects, but the patients with gout were taking appreciably more sugar than the control subjects. The median values were 103 grams of sugar a day for the gouty patients and 54 grams for the control subjects. Disease of the liver. The liver is the most active organ in the body. Every item of food and drink that has been digested in the alimentary canal and absorbed into the blood goes straight to the liver. There, the large vein carrying the blood from the alimentary canal breaks up into capillaries that bring the products of digestion close to the liver cells. In these cells, most of the varied substances resulting from digestion and absorption undergo chemical transformation into materials that are to be used by all the different organs of the body, including the liver itself, to repair their wear and tear, or to be metabolized as fuel, or to be stored for future use. In addition, the liver has the task of detoxifying several of the harmful materials that may have been present in the food or produced during metabolism. For all these reasons, the liver is one of the first organs to be affected by undesirable items in the diet. Many of the activities of the liver are affected not only directly by the arrival of varying quantities of these substances in the blood flowing through the liver, but also indirectly by changes in the hormone content of the blood. And since, as we saw, the amounts of at least 3 hormones are affected by sugar in the diet, we were keenly interested to look at some of the changes that sugar produces in the liver. I have already mentioned the enlargement of the liver that is produced by sugar. Part of this increase in size is caused by the accumulation of fat from the liver cells. In some instances, the amount of fat is enough to make the liver yellowish in color, just like the diseased fatty liver that occurs occasionally in people who are poisoned with such materials as chloroform or in alcoholics. When my colleagues investigated whether part of the enlargement of the liver was due to an enlargement of its cells or to an increase in the number of cells, it turned out that the effect of sugar is to increase both cell size and cell numbers. Although to some extent a technical matter, an increase in the number of liver cells shows that some of them have actually divided, indicating a more profound action of sugar than simply to make cells swell up. Most recently, we have been working closely with our colleagues in the biochemistry department at Queen Elizabeth College to study in more detail the changes that sugar produces in the liver. One of the reasons for this particular study was a report as long ago as 1949 that not only alcohol but also sugar can produce fibrosis of the liver, that is, an increase in the sort of scar tissue that precedes the development of cirrhosis of the liver. This research was carried out by a group of scientists led by Dr. Charles Best, who was one of the people responsible for the discovery of insulin in 1921. Other researchers have repeated the work of Best and his colleagues and produced the same results. All of this earlier work was done with rather special diets, lacking particular nutrients. That is why the research team at Queen Elizabeth College has been looking at the effects of our routine diets, which are not deficient in any obvious way, and differ only in whether or not the carbohydrate part of the diet includes sugar. The most recent experiments have used extremely sensitive biochemical analysis to detect in the blood and in the liver the chemical fragments that the body uses to build up the collagen that is increased in liver fibrosis. Collagen, which exists in several forms of slightly different chemical structure, is the protein that is present in the walls of the body's cells, and also makes up a great part of the connective tissue that exists in the sinews or tendons, in cartilage and bone, and in scar tissue. Our research has revealed that in sugar-fed rats there is a distinct increase in these fragments, both in the blood and in the liver, long before it is possible to detect fibrosis in the liver with the microscope. The same increase is seen in rats with diabetes and in human subjects with cirrhosis of the liver caused by chronic alcoholism. Is there a link between sugar and cancer? There are some cancers that appear to have become more common in the last 50 or 60 years, and that also appear to be more common in the affluent than in the poorer countries. So I thought it might be worthwhile to see whether there was any relationship between the numbers dying from these cancers in several countries and the amounts of sugar that their populations consumed. The usual snags faced us with the epidemiological studies. How many countries are there that keep proper records of the causes of death in their populations? Even where records are kept, how sure can you be that the diagnosis of cancer is correctly made, or made on exactly the same criteria in different countries? Some sorts of cancer can be diagnosed fairly readily. Others are often misdiagnosed. Because of this, we gave most attention to 3 or 4 where experts tell me that there is a reasonably good chance of correct diagnosis. The evidence at present comes chiefly from a study of international statistics and takes the form of an association between the average sugar consumption in different countries and the incidence of 2 or 3 particular forms of cancer. The cancers that seem most likely to be related to sugar consumption are cancer of the large intestine in men and women and cancer of the breast in women. The death rate for these 3 cancers in different countries is quite closely associated with average sugar consumption, to about the same extent, in fact, as the association between sugar consumption or fat consumption with the death rate due to coronary disease. An example is found in the international statistics for 1977 to 79 for breast cancer deaths in women over 65. The 5 countries with the highest rates are, in descending order, the UK, the Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark and Canada. The highest levels of sugar consumption, again in descending order, are in the UK, the Netherlands, Ireland, Canada and Denmark. On the other hand, the lowest mortality in ascending order is in Japan, Yugoslavia, Portugal, Spain and Italy, with the lowest sugar consumption in Japan, Portugal, Spain, Yugoslavia and Italy. My own observations of the association between sugar and cancer of the intestine and of the breast were made several years earlier than the study I have just quoted. I calculated what are called the correlation coefficients between these cancers and sugar consumption in all the countries for which statistics were then available. Let me first explain what correlation coefficients are, and let me take as an example the relation between people's height and weight. On the whole, the taller people are, the more they weigh, but it is all very well to say that there is, on the whole, this association between height and weight. It would be better if we could say how close this association is. supposing that it was a precise and exact association, so that the person who was only a little taller than another would inevitably be heavier, and one still taller would be still heavier. If this were so, you would say that the correlation coefficient was 1.0. Supposing, on the other hand, and this is even more unlikely, that there was no relationship whatever between height and weight, so that it would be just as likely for a man weighing 150 pounds to be 5 feet tall or 6 feet tall. In this case, the correlation coefficient would be 0. In fact, there is a relationship, but not a precise one. Tall people tend to be heavier. If you work it out exactly, for adult men, the correlation coefficient between height and weight comes to about 0.6. The correlation coefficients I have found so far for cancer and sugar consumption in different countries are as follows. Cancer of the large intestine in men, 0.60. Cancer of the large intestine in women, 0.50. Cancer of the breast, 0.63. However, such international statistics, as I have stressed repeatedly, can do no more than give a clue as to the possible role of sugar or fat in producing disease. But there are indirect studies that suggest why sugar might increase the risk of women developing cancer of the breast and of both men and women developing cancer of the large bowel. During the past 10 years, the development of cancer of the breast has been linked with the female sex hormones, especially estrogen. Evidence for this association comes from studies in several different countries. It has been suggested that cancer of the bowel may be caused by a high concentration of insulin in the blood, but a more likely possibility, put forward by workers in America, Hawaii, and England, is that, like breast cancer, it is estrogen that is involved. Again, there has recently been an increase in the incidence of testicular cancer in young men, and it has been shown that their mothers were often overweight during pregnancy and have an increased concentration of estrogen in their blood. Whatever is ultimately shown to be the cause of these cancers, the fact is that a high consumption of sugar can produce an increased blood concentration of both these hormones, insulin and estrogen. There have also been suggestions that other dietary components might be involved in causing cancer, especially of the bowel. One suggestion blames a lack of dietary fiber. A second is that it is caused by an excess of saturated fat and a deficiency of polyunsaturated fat. I have already explained why, on evolutionary grounds, dietary fiber, especially from cereals, and polyunsaturated fat, largely from oilseeds, are not likely to have been significant contributors to the diets of our ancestors, long before there began to be a high prevalence of the diseases of affluence. Moreover, Japan, with a very low incidence of bowel cancer, has a fiber intake very similar to that of the UK, and experimentally it is polyunsaturated fats rather than saturated fats that tend to produce cancer in animals. Sugar and drug addiction. Let me here add one more interesting effect of sugar, although no one has yet pursued it sufficiently to see if it has any practical application. A dozen or so years ago, some of my colleagues looked at the question of whether diet has any effect on the action of drugs. They gave a common sedative drug, phenobarbital, Nembutal, to rats that had been fed on a diet in which the carbohydrate was either starch or sugar, and they recorded how long the animals slept after taking the drug. They found that the rats taking the sugar diet slept for a significantly shorter time than did the rats taking the starch diet, on average 98 minutes compared with 141 minutes. This discovery raises several questions. would sugar decrease the effect of Nembutal in human beings as well as rats? If sugar has this effect, do other dietary components behave in the same way? Can you deliberately decrease or increase the effects of other drugs by changing the diet? If so, would the effect be produced simply by changing the amount of sugar or other dietary component for just a day or two before the drug treatment begins, or even at the time it begins? Clearly, there is a lot more research to be done by nutritionists and pharmacologists before we have the answers to these questions. Sugar and protein. One of the unexpected effects that we found when putting sugar into the diet was that it interferes with the body's use of the protein in the diet. We first noticed this when we fed our rats a diet that was low but usually adequate in protein. When fed on our normal diet with starch, the rats grew perfectly well. But when we replaced the starch with sugar, their growth was retarded. Looking more closely at the reason for this, we found that the sugar interfered with the body's use of protein, so that the rats lost protein instead of accumulating it as they should when growing. Protein utilization is measured in an indirect way. You measure the nitrogen in the diet. Since virtually all of this is in the dietary protein, you also measure the amount of nitrogen in the urine, which is where the body gets rid of the products of protein metabolism. If the dietary nitrogen is more than the urinary nitrogen, the body is retaining some protein, and this we call a positive nitrogen balance. If the dietary nitrogen is less than the urinary nitrogen, the body is losing protein. That is, the body is in a negative nitrogen balance. Here then are the results of 3 of our experiments with rats. Effect of sugar on protein utilization. Experiment 1. With no sugar, plus 17. With sugar, minus 2. Experiment 2. With no sugar, plus 17. With sugar, plus 2. Experiment 3. With no sugar, plus 6. With sugar, minus 6. This work with animals suggests that a diet low in protein may be even more deficient when it is accompanied by sugar. It seems that the usefulness of a given amount of protein, its value in promoting growth, is diminished when sugar is present in the diet. While there is no direct evidence that what is true of rats and chickens is equally true of growing children, this relationship could be of particular interest in poorer countries. One of the characteristics of such countries is the enormous increase in urbanization. There is a tremendous influx of people from the country into the big cities of India, Thailand, South America, Ghana, Nigeria, and so on. The chief effect on the diets of the new arrivals, mostly extremely poor, is an increase in the consumption of manufactured foods such as cakes and biscuits and soft drinks, so that they take even less protein than before, but more sugar. If the effect in children is similar to that in young animals, the combination of sugar and low protein would explain even better the high incidence of protein deficiency than would the low protein alone. It is protein deficiency that causes the dreaded disease kwashiorkor that is so common and often fatal in the developing countries. A high intake of sugar is usually a feature of diets in well-off countries, and these are more likely to be adequately supplied with protein and usually with other nutrients too. The question has been raised whether this high intake of sugar causes an increase in growth rather than a decrease, and we shall look at this in the following chapter. A wide range of disorders. This is a very mixed collection of diseases, to be sure. Cancer, dental caries, short and long sight, dermatitis and gout, as well as coronary disease, diabetes, and various digestive conditions. And the evidence that they are caused in part by an excessive consumption of sugar is by no means equally convincing for all of them. At one extreme, it seems that everybody is certain about the role of sugar in dental caries, except perhaps the manufacturers of biscuits and confectionery. At the other extreme, there is as yet not much evidence that cancer of the colon or of the breast is really any more likely to appear in people who eat a lot of sugar. I shall, however, be content if you will agree that for cancer especially, but also for gout and seborrheic dermatitis and refraction errors of the eye, it is worthwhile to pursue research to test the possible role of sugar in producing these conditions.